The studio lights shone brightly, reflecting off the sleek black table that separated the host from his guest. The air was thick with anticipation, an almost tangible tension that pulsed through the room. The audience sat still, their eyes locked on the young man seated across from one of the most notorious political interviewers in the country. This wasn't just another interview. This was a setup, a moment designed to break him, to expose him, to humiliate him in front of me. The host leaned forward, a predatory smile curving his lips, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk as he prepared to strike. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. So, Barron, he said smoothly, his voice carefully measured, laced with faux politeness. This is your first major interview. A lot of people are curious. What exactly do you stand for, or are you just here because of your last name? A ripple of murmurs ran through the audience. It was an opening jab, calculated and deliberate. A lesser guest might have flinched, hesitated, maybe even stammered a response, trying to prove themselves. But Barron didn't move. He sat there, composed, his expression unreadable. He was young, yes, but the confidence in his posture, the calm way he met the host's eyes, sent a different message. He wasn't here to play defense. The host took the silence as an opportunity to push further. I mean, let's be honest, he continued, his voice now edged with condescension. Your father, he's a controversial figure, to say the least. And many people wonder if you've ever had a thought, a belief, an idea of your own that wasn't spoon-fed to you at the dinner table. A few people in the audience chuckled. The trap had been set. The young Trump was supposed to get flustered, to fumble through a response, to confirm every stereotype they had projected onto him. But still, Barron remained unmoved. The silence stretched just long enough to shift the energy in the room. The host, expecting an immediate reaction, blinked. Something wasn't going according to plan. Then, finally, Barron leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlacing as he rested his hands on the table. His voice was steady, controlled, with just the faintest trace of amusement. Are you asking me a question, he said, or are you just hoping I'll react the way you want me to? The room tensed. The host's smirk flickered for the briefest second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A crack, and the audience felt it. A shift in the balance of power. The game had only just begun. The studio was a masterpiece of modern production, designed to command attention. Dark walls, sleek screens flashing highlights of past interviews, and a massive illuminated logo towering behind the host's desk. The air conditioning was perfectly calibrated, ensuring that neither sweat nor discomfort would betray nervousness. Every chair in the live audience had been strategically placed, filled with a mix of eager spectators and carefully selected individuals meant to react at key moments. This was not just an interview. This was theater, and the audience was primed for a spectacle. Across from the host, Barron Trump sat with the kind of presence that was both unexpected and unsettling. He was young, yes, but there was an undeniable weight to him. He didn't fidget, he didn't glance nervously at the cameras. He sat straight, composed, hands resting lightly on the table in front of him, a posture that suggested neither submission nor arrogance, just quiet control. His expression was unreadable, his eyes steady, absorbing everything but revealing nothing. This wasn't the image they wanted. He was supposed to look inexperienced, unprepared, out of his depth. Instead, he exuded the kind of calm that made people uneasy. The host, seasoned and ruthless, had built a career on dissecting guests, pushing them into corners they couldn't escape from. He prided himself on exposing hypocrisy, dismantling talking points, reducing his opponents to stammering contradictions. He had faced senators, CEOs, even former presidents, and each time he had walked away with the upper hand. Barron, however, was different. Not because of what he had done. He had barely spoken in public before, but because of what he represented. He wasn't just a guest, he was a symbol that half the country wanted to elevate and the other half wanted to see crumble. and tonight the host planned to deliver exactly that. He shifted in his chair, a subtle move, adjusting his approach. The opening had not gone as planned. The first question was supposed to establish dominance, to rattle Barron just enough to set the tone for the rest of the interview, but the young Trump had not reacted as expected. Instead of scrambling for a response, he had flipped the dynamic, putting the pressure back on the host. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. The crew, watching from behind the cameras, sensed the shift as well. They had seen this play out 100 times before. A guest, no matter how confident, always cracked under the right amount of pressure. It was only a matter of time. The host leaned forward again, an easy smile on his face, the one he had perfected over years of live television. "I have to say," he continued, his voice smooth, conversational, masking the sharpened edge beneath, "you're remarkably composed for someone in your position. Most people in your situation would feel some pressure, given the weight of expectations. After all, your name alone carries, let's say, a bit of history." A flicker of movement in the audience, a woman leaning slightly forward, a man crossing his arms. They were waiting for the response. Was he going to deflect? Dodge? Offer some rehearsed line about individuality? But Barron simply tilted his head slightly, considering. "Everyone carries history," he finally said, his tone measured. "The real question is whether you let other people define it for you." The host's lips parted just slightly before curving into another smile. He nodded, as if entertained, but there was something else there too, a calculation. The boy was more prepared than anticipated. No matter, the real questions hadn't even begun. The host shifted in his chair, adjusting his posture just slightly, the kind of movement that wouldn't be noticeable to most viewers at home, but was unmistakable to those in the room. It was the subtle recalibration of a man who had just realized his opponent wasn't as easy to corner as he had expected. The audience, sensing this shift in energy, remained still, their collective focus locked onto the young man sitting across from one of the most skilled interviewers in the business. The host smiled again, but this time there was something forced about it, just the faintest hint of effort behind the expression. He had gone into this expecting an easy takedown, a slow dismantling of an unprepared guest who would flounder the moment the conversation turned serious. That wasn't happening, and now he had to adjust his approach. "That's an interesting answer," he said, tilting his head slightly, his voice taking on a note of amusement, as if he were indulging a student who had just given an unexpectedly sharp response in a classroom debate. "But let's be real, Barron, you didn't grow up like everyone else. You weren't just some kid in America trying to figure out who he was. You were raised in a world most people can't even imagine. Powering penthouses, private security, exclusive schools, every door was already open to you before you even knew how to walk. So when you talk about defining yourself, I have to wonder, what exactly do you think you've had to define? Because from where most people stand, your life was already set in stone before you even had a say in it." A carefully crafted question, the kind that left no good escape. If Barron acknowledged his privilege, he risked sounding out of touch, reinforcing the very narrative the host was constructing around him. If he pushed back too forcefully, he'd come off as defensive, perhaps even entitled. Either way, it was a question meant to control the framing of the conversation, to keep Barron on the back foot. The audience responded with a soft ripple of murmurs, a mix of curiosity and anticipation. They were waiting to see how he would handle it. Barron didn't respond immediately. He sat there, unbothered, his expression unreadable. He wasn't rushing to defend himself, nor was he scrambling for words. He let the question settle in the air for just a second longer than expected, creating a silence that forced the host to maintain eye contact, to hold the moment rather than move on. The host had expected some kind of immediate reaction, an instinctive response, maybe a flash of annoyance, perhaps even a nervous chuckle. Instead, he was met with absolute stillness. It was a simple but effective reversal of power, a reminder that silence could be just as commanding as words. Finally, Barron leaned forward slightly, his hands still resting on the table, his fingers lightly interlaced. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, controlled, carrying just the faintest trace of amusement. "You assume that privilege means never having to define yourself," he said. that it makes things easier, but in reality it means everyone else tries to define you first. And if you don't push back, if you don't decide who you actually are, then you just become whatever they say you are. For the first time since the interview had started, the host hesitated. It was quick, barely a fraction of a second, but it was there. A moment where he had to recalibrate his next move. He had expected a justification, or at the very least, a concession to the premise of the question. Instead, Barron had flipped the frame entirely. The host's lips parted slightly, then curled into a smile again, though this time it was thinner, less effortless. "That's a nice philosophical take," he said smoothly, nodding as if considering it. "But let's talk about something concrete. Your father's presidency was, let's say, polarizing. To some, he was a leader who reshaped America. To others, he was a dangerous figure who divided the country. Either way, you were there, growing up in the middle of it. Do you think the criticism of him was justified? Or are you going to sit here and tell me the media just made it all up?" This was it. The real attack. The question designed not to be answered but to force a reaction. It was a trap laid so cleanly that it almost didn't need to be explained. If Barron defended his father outright, the headlines would write themselves. "Young Trump denies reality, ignores controversies." If he acknowledged any of the criticisms, it would be spun as an admission, a moment of separation from his father that the media could exploit. The host leaned forward slightly, his hands steepled together, eyes sharp, watching closely. The audience was silent, waiting for the moment when the young Trump would finally stumble. Barron exhaled slowly, then did something unexpected. He tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth curling just a fraction. Not quite a smirk, not quite a smile, just the smallest indication that he saw exactly what was happening. His fingers drummed lightly against the table, not out of nervousness, but as if he were considering just how much he wanted to say. Then, finally, he spoke. "Fine. I think people are free to have their opinions," he said, his tone unreadable. "And I think people are free to believe what they want, even if it isn't true." The reaction was instant, a ripple of murmurs, a sharp inhale from someone in the audience. The host's fingers tightened around the nut cards in his hand, just slightly. The answer wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't an outright defense, but it also wasn't an admission. It was something else, something that left just enough room for interpretation while denying him a clear angle to attack. For the first time in the night, the balance of power in the room shifted. The host's fingers curled slightly around his stack of note cards, his grip tightening just enough to betray his frustration. He was too seasoned to show outright irritation, but something had changed. The rhythm of the interview was slipping from his grasp, and he knew it. Barron wasn't supposed to be this controlled, this composed. He was supposed to show cracks, to hesitate, to fumble through the carefully placed verbal landmines designed to put him on the defensive. Instead, he was sitting there, unshaken, unbothered, effortlessly maneuvering through the traps with an ease that was beginning to unsettle not just the host, but the audience as well. The murmurs had grown quieter now, but the silence was heavier, more charged. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore, they were watching a battle of control. They had seen this host break senators, CEOs, public figures with decades of experience in the media. But Barron Trump was proving to be a different kind of challenge. He wasn't fighting back in the way they expected. He wasn't defensive, nor was he overly aggressive. He simply refused to be cornered, and that, more than anything, was throwing the host off balance. The host forced a smile, shifting slightly in his seat. "All right," he said, his tone still smooth but now carrying an unmistakable edge. "That's a clever way of dodging the question. But let's not pretend we're dealing in vague hypotheticals here. Your father wasn't just criticized. He was accused of inciting division, of spreading misinformation, of undermining democratic institutions. Are you saying that none of that is true? That the media simply invented all of it out of thin air?" His voice sharpened on the last sentence, his cadence shifting just enough to turn the question into a demand. It was no longer just about Barron's answer, it was about forcing him to pick a side, to either denounce the media or distance himself from his father. The audience shifted, leaning in. This was the moment they had been waiting for. the moment the young Trump would either crumble or lash out. But Barron did neither. He exhaled slowly, barely perceptible, his fingers tapping lightly against the table once before he stilled them again. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't flustered. He was calculating, and the audience could feel it. "The media isn't a single entity," he finally said, his voice calm. "It's made up of people, and people have biases. They have agendas. That's not a conspiracy. That's just human nature. Some of those people reported things fairly, others didn't. And some didn't even try." The host's expression flickered. Just for a second. Just enough for the cameras to catch it. This wasn't a soundbite he could easily twist. It wasn't an outright attack, nor was it an admission. It was a statement of fact, carefully phrased, designed to leave no clear opening. The murmurs in the audience returned, not loud, but growing, shifting in tone. The host inhaled sharply through his nose, the first real sign of irritation breaking through his polished exterior. He glanced briefly at the camera feed, knowing producers were watching, waiting for him to regain control. He had taken down political strategists, dismantled press secretaries, exposed billionaires on live television. He wasn't about to lose control of an interview with a 20-something who had never even done one before. He leaned forward slightly, his smile returning, but colder now, sharper. "That's an easy thing to say when you've never had to deal with real consequences," he said, his voice quiet but laced with challenge. "You grew up in a world where everything was handled for you, where problems were solved with money and connections. But let's talk about the real world for a second. Do you think the people who lost their jobs, who had their lives upended because of your father's policies, had the same luxury to sit back and say, 'Oh well, it's just human nature'?" The weight of the words landed hard, echoing in the silence that followed. The host knew how to weaponize emotion, how to frame a question so that any response other than full capitulation would make his guest look heartless, out of touch. It was a tactic that had worked countless times before, but tonight, something was different. Barron didn't react immediately. He didn't rush to answer, didn't shift uncomfortably in his seat, or let any trace of guilt flicker across his expression. Instead, he did something far worse for the host. He smiled. Just slightly, just enough for the audience to notice. Not amusement, not arrogance, just an understanding of exactly what was happening. "That's interesting," he said finally, tilting his head slightly, his tone thoughtful, "because I could ask you the same thing." The audience stirred. The host's smile wavered ever so briefly. He recovered quickly, shaking his head as if to brush the comment aside. "Oh, come on," he said, letting out a small chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's a lazy deflection. I'm not the one who—" "But you are," Barron interrupted, his voice still perfectly even. "You're sitting here talking about consequences as if they only exist on one side. How many people lost their jobs because of policies your side pushed? How many businesses were destroyed? How many families suffered because of the narratives that networks like yours promoted?" The murmurs in the audience grew louder, the shift in energy impossible to ignore now. The host blinked, lips parting slightly as if to interject, but Barron didn't stop. "You frame this as if there's only one reality, one truth that everyone has to accept, but that's not how the world works. People have different experiences, different perspectives. And the fact that you only want to talk about one side of that doesn't make you a journalist, it makes you an activist." The silence that followed was deafening. The host's fingers tightened around his note cards. The audience wasn't just watching anymore, they were reacting. And for the first time in the interview, it wasn't on his terms. The host's grip on his note cards tightened, his knuckles turning just a shade paler under the studio lights. The silence that had settled over the room wasn't the comfortable kind he was used to. It wasn't the silence of an audience hanging on his words, waiting for him to deliver the next carefully structured takedown. It was heavier, more uncertain. It was the kind of silence that signaled something had shifted, something that wasn't supposed to happen. Barron Trump had done what so many others had failed to do. He had flipped the script. He hadn't lashed out, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stumbled over a poorly thought-out defense. He had simply, methodically, dismantled the premise of the host's argument. And in doing so, he had forced the conversation into territory the host no longer controlled. The host forced a chuckle, shaking his head as if shaking off a weak punch. "Oh, come on," he said, his voice regaining some of its performative ease, though there was now a slight tightness around his eyes. "Now you're just playing the whataboutism game. That's a classic move, but it doesn't actually answer the question. I'm asking you about the impact of your father's presidency, and instead of addressing that, you're turning it back on me, as if that somehow changes reality." Barron didn't respond immediately. He let the host's words linger in the air, let them settle into the audience's minds. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. He wasn't rushing, wasn't reacting emotionally, and that was what was making the host's job so much harder. Finally, Barron tilted his head slightly and exhaled. "You keep talking about reality," he said, his voice calm. "But whose reality are we talking about? Yours? The media's? Because that's the problem, isn't it? Reality isn't just one thing. It depends on where you're standing, who you're listening to, what you choose to focus on." He let his words sink in before continuing, his gaze locked onto the host. "You want me to play this game where I either defend everything my father did or distance myself from him. But that's not a conversation, that's a setup, and I think you know that." The host's smile twitched. Just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough for anyone paying attention. He could feel the room slipping from his grasp. He had been in this position before, but never quite like this. Never with someone who refused to follow the unwritten rules of the exchange. "Barron," he said, his voice firmer now, less playful, less amused. "Let's not pretend you're some neutral observer in all of this. Your name carries weight, it carries responsibility. And whether you like it or not, people look at you and expect you to stand for something. So let's get real here. Do you support what your father did as president? Do you believe in what he stood for?" This was it. The moment the host had been steering towards all along. A direct question, one that left no room for vague philosophical musings. Answer yes, and Barron would be branded as an unwavering extension of his father, carrying all the baggage that came with it. Answer no, and he would be framed as disloyal, someone who had turned on his own family. It was the kind of question that had unraveled countless guests before, forcing them into a corner where every answer was a losing one. Barron exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Then, instead of answering immediately, he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an awkward deflection, but something else. Something quieter, more confident. The host's fingers tightened just slightly around his note cards again, sensing the shift before it even fully happened. "I think my father can speak for himself," Barron said finally, his voice even. "And I think he has, many times. You don't need me to tell you what he stood for. You already know. Everyone in this room already knows. What you want is for me to say something you can use. You want a soundbite, something you can clip, something you can frame in a headline. But I'm not here to give you that." The reaction in the room was immediate. A few murmurs, shifting seats, the sound of someone in the back exhaling just a little too loudly. The host opened his mouth, then closed it again, recalculating. He had expected resistance, sure, but not like this. He had expected someone who would either crumble under pressure or lash out defensively. Instead, he was facing someone who wasn't playing the game at all, someone who had simply removed himself from the equation the moment the host tried to dictate the terms. The host shook his head, his lips pressing together in something that was meant to look like amusement but didn't quite reach his eyes. "All right," he said slowly, his voice measured. "So you're not going to answer that directly. Fair enough, but let's talk about something you can't deflect. Your last name. Whether you like it or not, it carries a certain expectation, a responsibility. Do you plan to follow in your father's footsteps? Politics, business, what's next for you?" It was an attempt to regain control, to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but Barron was already a step ahead. He let a beat of silence pass before answering. "I don't think anyone can follow in my father's footsteps," he said simply, his tone making it impossible to tell if it was a compliment or a neutral observation. "He was his own person, just like I am." The host blinked, just for a second, a tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation. But in that second, the audience saw it. The cameras caught it. The energy in the room had fully shifted now, and everyone knew it. Barron Trump wasn't being broken down. He wasn't unraveling. He wasn't playing along with the script. He was doing something far worse for the host. He was winning. The host inhaled slowly, controlling his expression, but it was clear now this wasn't going the way he had planned. The audience had sensed the shift, the undeniable change in power. He had tried to push Barron Trump into a corner, to force him into a moment of weakness, a slip, an emotional reaction that could be dissected and replayed in clips across the internet. Instead, he had found himself in a battle of control, and control was something Barron refused to give up. The host glanced at his note cards, flipping one over with the kind of casualness that betrayed effort. He was searching now, recalibrating, looking for another way in. "All right," he said, his voice measured, masking the frustration beneath. "Let's step away from politics for a moment. You spent most of your life in the public eye, whether you wanted to or not. You didn't choose your last name, but you've had to live with everything that comes with it. The scrutiny, the expectations, the judgment. A lot of people would say that gives you a unique platform, a voice that carries weight. So, let me ask you this. If you could tell the world one thing about yourself, something they don't already assume, what would it be?" It was an attempt to pivot, to regain control of the conversation by giving Barron something that seemed personal, disarming, a question that might finally crack the exterior of calm detachment he had maintained throughout the interview. It was the host's last play, to steer the conversation into something softer, something more introspective, in hopes that vulnerability would create an opening. But Barron didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to consider the weight of the question, because the weight of assumptions was something he had carried for years. "I don't need to tell the world anything," he said simply, his voice even. "They're going to believe what they want, no matter what I say." The air in the studio changed. The host blinked once, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he masked it with a small, knowing smile. "That's a bit of a cynical take, isn't it?" he asked, tilting his head. "You don't think you have any control over how people see you?" Barron exhaled slowly, as if this conversation was nothing new to him, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "I think people see what they want to see," he said. "You came into this interview with an idea of who I am. The audience did too. Maybe some of them expected me to be unprepared, out of my depth. Maybe others wanted me to be a perfect representation of their expectations. But none of that has anything to do with me. That's just what happens when people only see a name instead of a person." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before them. The host opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. This wasn't what he had wanted. This wasn't the moment he had spent the last 45 minutes constructing. Barron wasn't giving him the reaction, the confession, the mistake that could be spun into something else. He was refusing the game entirely. The audience was no longer shifting uncomfortably. They were locked in, aware that something rare was happening, something different from the usual script they had grown used to seeing play out on this very stage. The host had built a career on turning interviews into battles, on exposing flaws, contradictions, weaknesses. But tonight, the cracks weren't showing where they were supposed to. He forced another smile, but it didn't hold the same ease it had at the beginning. "So you're saying none of this bothers you?" he asked. "The assumptions, the criticisms, the headlines. You've been called everything from privileged to irrelevant to an enigma. And you're telling me none of that gets to you?" Barron's expression didn't change, but his eyes held something sharper now, something more deliberate. "People talk," he said simply. "It doesn't mean I have to listen." The audience let out a soft murmur, not loud, but present. A shift. The host had nothing left. He had tried to corner him, to bait him, to frame him into an admission or an outburst. Instead, Barron had remained exactly where he had been from the start, unshaken, unreadable, in complete control of himself. The host glanced at the camera, knowing they were nearing the end of the segment. He forced one last smile, nodding as if the conversation had gone exactly as planned. "Well," he said, adjusting his note cards one final time, "I think we've covered quite a bit tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me." Barron nodded once. "Thanks for having me." The host turned to the camera, wrapping up in his usual polished way, but it no longer carried the same authority. The audience wasn't thinking about him anymore. They were thinking about the guest who had just rewritten the expected narrative in real time. And as the cameras cut to black, the energy in the room spoke louder than anything that had been said. Barron Trump had walked in as a guest. He had walked out as something else entirely. The interview had barely ended when the internet erupted. Within minutes, clips of Barron Trump's calm, measured responses were circulating on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, each one dissected frame by frame. Some focused on his refusal to be baited, others on the host's visible frustration as his usual tactics failed. The hashtags Barron Trump interview and not what they expected and he didn't fall for it began trending almost immediately. The contrast was undeniable. Where other guests had stumbled, hesitated, or fought back in a way that played into the host's hands, Barron had done something different. He hadn't just defended himself, he had refused to play the game entirely. Pundits scrambled to interpret what had happened. On one side, media figures tried to frame the interview as evasive or lacking substance, but those takes didn't land the way they usually did. The audience wasn't buying it. People weren't talking about what Barron had failed to say, they were talking about how effortlessly he had controlled the conversation without ever raising his voice. They were talking about how the host, known for dismantling his guests, had spent most of the interview looking like the one struggling to keep up. Reaction videos flooded YouTube, with commentators across the political spectrum breaking down the moment where the balance of power had shifted. Conservative voices called it a masterclass in handling a hostile media, while even some neutral observers admitted that Barron had been far more composed and intelligent than they had expected. "I thought this was going to be a train wreck," one viral tweet read. "Instead, it was one of the most strategic interviews I've ever seen. He knew exactly what he was doing." Memes spread instantly. Screenshots of the host's increasingly frustrated expressions were plastered across social media, captioned with phrases like, "when the usual tricks don't work," and "that moment you realize you underestimated the other player." A particular clip of Barron tilting his head slightly, smiling just enough to show he saw through the setup, became a GIF used by thousands. Even those who weren't fans of his family had to acknowledge that he had handled himself in a way no one had predicted. By the next morning, mainstream news outlets were forced to acknowledge the impact. Some tried to downplay it, focusing on his lack of direct answers to certain questions. Others admitted, with varying degrees of reluctance, that he had held his own in a way few had expected. The host himself avoided making any public comments, but insiders leaked that the production team had been blindsided. They had expected an easy segment. Instead, they had watched the narrative slip away from them in real time. And Barron? He said nothing. He didn't tweet, didn't post any follow-ups, didn't engage with the media storm unfolding around him. He didn't need to. The moment had already spoken for itself.